Welcome to Heartfelt Tales, where the quiet corners of life explode into stories you'll never forget. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into a suburban saga that'll grip you tighter than a breaking news headline. Think peaceful streets turned battlegrounds, neighbors clashing in a war of noise and nerves, and a single woman's fight to reclaim her sanity. This isn't just a tale, it's a roller coaster of tension, defiance, and raw human spirit, packed with twists you won't see coming. We've got over an hour of jaw-dropping details ahead, every moment loaded with revelations, so stick with us to the end to catch the full story. Trust me, you'll miss the real scoop if you don't. Hit that like button now to fuel this journey, smash subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a beat, and drop a comment below. Tell us, have you ever faced a neighbor from hell? Let's get started, because this is Heartfelt Tales, and the truth is about to hit hard. ##### Part 1, Setting the Scene and Introducing the Characters. The neighborhood of Willow Creek was a quiet slice of suburban America, nestled on the outskirts of a bustling city that seemed a world away. Rows of neatly trimmed lawns stretched out beneath the shade of towering oak trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The houses varied in style. Some were modest single-story ranches with faded shutters, others two-story colonials with pristine white porches, and a few modern builds with sleek lines and solar panels glinting in the sun. It was the kind of place where people waved from their driveways, where the hum of lawnmowers on Saturday mornings was the loudest sound you'd hear, and where the occasional bark of a dog or the laughter of kids riding bikes punctuated the stillness. For years, Willow Creek had been a haven of predictability, a refuge for those who craved peace over chaos. At the end of Maple Lane lived Emily Carter, a 34-year-old graphic designer who had moved into her cozy ranch-style home 3 years ago. With its pale blue siding and a small front porch adorned with hanging flower baskets, the house suited her perfectly. Emily was a solitary soul by choice, though not unfriendly. She enjoyed her own company, her quiet evenings spent sketching at her drafting table or curled up with a book and a glass of wine. Her dark hair was often pulled into a loose bun, and her hazel eyes carried a thoughtful intensity that hinted at her creative mind. She worked remotely for a small design firm, a job that allowed her to savor the silence of her home, until recently, that is. Emily had always appreciated her neighbors. To her left lived the Hendersons, an older couple who spent their days tending to an impeccable rose garden and exchanging pleasantries over the fence. To her right was Mrs. Delaney, a widow in her 70s who baked cookies for the neighborhood kids and kept her TV volume low enough that Emily never heard a peep. Across the street, the Garcias raised two polite teenagers who waved shyly whenever they crossed paths. It was a community of unspoken agreements: keep the noise down, respect the space, and everyone gets along. That was, until the new neighbors moved in. The house next to Emily's had been vacant for months after the previous owners, a quiet retired couple, moved to Florida. When the "for sale" sign finally came down, Emily watched with mild curiosity as a moving truck rolled up. Out stepped the newcomers, a group of 3 20-somethings who seemed to carry an air of restless energy. There was Jake, a lanky guy with a mop of blonde hair and a perpetual grin, who appeared to be the ringleader. Then came Mia, a petite woman with a loud laugh and a habit of tossing her dyed pink hair over her shoulder. Rounding out the trio was Tyler, a stocky guy with a deep voice who hauled boxes with the ease of someone who spent more time at the gym than anywhere else. They weren't a family in the traditional sense, more like a pack of friends who decided to split rent on a place bigger than they needed. Their furniture was a mismatched collection of thrift store finds, and their front yard soon sprouted a couple of folding chairs and a rusty fire pit. At first, Emily didn't mind them. They were young, probably fresh out of college, and she remembered her own days of late-night laughter and reckless freedom. She'd caught snippets of their conversations as they unloaded, something about Jake being a bartender, Mia working at a tattoo parlor, and Tyler doing something with cars. Their professions didn't matter much to her. What did was the faint thump of bass she'd heard leaking from their windows that first weekend. It wasn't loud enough to complain about, just enough to make her pause mid-sketch and glance toward their house. She brushed it off. New neighbors, new adjustments. She'd give them time to settle in. But settling in, it turned out, wasn't their style. The first real party happened 2 weeks after they arrived, on a Friday night in late February. Emily had just finished a long day of tweaking a client's logo when the music started. It was around 9 p.m., not an unreasonable hour, she told herself, but the steady pulse of electronic beats seeped through her walls like an uninvited guest. She peeked out her living room window and saw a dozen or so people milling around their front yard, red Solo cups in hand, their voices rising in a chorus of laughter and shouts. A few cars lined the street, their headlights briefly illuminating her porch as they pulled up. The fire pit crackled, sending sparks into the chilly night air, and someone had dragged a speaker onto the porch, its volume cranked high enough to rattle the glass in Emily's windows. She tried to ignore it. She closed her curtains, turned on her own music, soft jazz, a feudal counterpoint, and focused on her sketchpad. But the noise was relentless. By 11 p.m., the party had grown louder, the bass thumping in her chest like a second heartbeat. She went to bed with a pillow over her head, but sleep eluded her. The laughter, the clinking of bottles, the occasional whoop of someone clearly too drunk to care, it all bled into her room until the clock read 2 a.m. When the last stragglers finally stumbled out around 3, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her nerves frayed. The next morning, Emily dragged herself to the kitchen, bleary-eyed and irritable. She brewed coffee and glanced out the window. The neighbor's yard was a mess, empty cups scattered across the grass, a couple of beer cans glinting in the morning sun, and the fire pit still smoldering. Jake emerged briefly, yawning as he kicked a can toward the curb, then disappeared back inside. Emily sighed. One night, she told herself. They'd had their fun. Surely it wouldn't happen again so soon. She was wrong. The following weekend, it happened again. This time, the party started earlier, around 7 p.m., and the crowd was bigger, maybe 20 people, spilling from the house into the yard and even onto the sidewalk. The music was louder, too, a mix of hip-hop and pop that pulsed through the neighborhood like a living thing. Emily tried to work, but the noise drowned out her thoughts. She paced her living room, her frustration mounting with every beat. By 10 p.m., she'd had enough. She wasn't confrontational by nature, but this was her home, her sanctuary. She deserved peace. Steeling herself, Emily slipped on a jacket and marched next door. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and cheap beer as she approached their porch. Jake was lounging in one of the folding chairs, a cigarette dangling from his lips, while Mia danced with a couple of strangers nearby. Emily cleared her throat. "Hey," she said, raising her voice over the music. Jake looked up, his grin widening as if she'd come to join the fun. "Hi, I'm Emily, from next door. I was just wondering if you could turn the music down a bit. It's getting pretty late, and I've got work tomorrow." Jake nodded, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Oh, yeah, sure thing, neighbor. Didn't realize it was that loud. We'll keep it chill." Mia chimed in, her voice bright and slurred. "Sorry about that. We're just having a little housewarming thing. You should come hang out sometime." Emily forced a smile. "Thanks, I'll think about it. Just, maybe wrap it up soon." "No problem," Jake said, standing to fiddle with the speaker. The volume dropped slightly, not enough to make a real difference, but enough to signal the conversation was over. Emily nodded and retreated, feeling a mix of relief and unease. They'd seemed friendly enough, but their apologies felt flimsy, like words tossed out to placate her. Back home, she waited. The music stayed at its lower volume for about 20 minutes before creeping back up. The party raged on until 1 a.m., and Emily spent another night staring at her ceiling, her patience wearing thin. The next day, she noticed the Hendersons exchanging weary glances over their roses, and Mrs. Delaney muttered something about "those kids" when Emily picked up her mail. It wasn't just her, the whole street was feeling the strain. Over the next week, the noise became a pattern. Not every night, but often enough to disrupt her life. She'd wake to the sound of laughter at odd hours, or find her focus shattered by a sudden burst of music while she worked. Her sketches grew sloppy, her deadlines loomed, and her coffee intake doubled. She tried earplugs, white noise machines, even rearranging her furniture to muffle the sound. Nothing worked. The peace she'd cherished was slipping away, replaced by a simmering resentment she couldn't shake. Finally, after a particularly raucous Thursday night that left her sleepless and furious, Emily decided enough was enough. She'd tried being polite, and it had gotten her nowhere. As she stood in her kitchen, gripping her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles whitened, she resolved to confront them again, this time with less patience and more insistence. She didn't know what she'd say, or how they'd react, but she couldn't keep living like this. Willow Creek was her home, and she'd fight to keep it that way. Part 2, The Escalation of the Problem. The fragile peace Emily Carter had fought to maintain in Willow Creek didn't just crumble, it shattered. What started as an occasional annoyance morphed into a relentless assault on her senses, her routine, and her sanity. The parties next door didn't stay confined to weekends anymore. By mid-March, Jake, Mia, and Tyler seemed to have declared open season on quiet nights, throwing gatherings on Tuesdays, Thursdays, even the occasional Monday. The thumping bass, once an intermittent disruption, became a near-nightly fixture, stretching well past midnight and sometimes into the early hours of the morning. Emily's little blue ranch house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a bunker under siege. The noise wasn't just louder, it was more chaotic. The trio upgraded their speaker system, or maybe they just stopped caring about volume control. The music shifted from tolerable background beats to pounding EDM tracks that rattled her windows and vibrated through her floors. Then came the karaoke. One Wednesday night, Emily jolted awake at 1 a.m. to the sound of Jake belting out a drunken rendition of Sweet Caroline, his voice cracking on every high note while Mia and a chorus of strangers shouted the chorus off-key. The next night, it was shouting matches, someone yelling about a spilled drink, another voice slurring insults, followed by the crash of what sounded like a bottle hitting the pavement. The fire pit stayed lit longer, the laughter grew wilder, and the crowd swelled. Emily stopped counting the cars lining Maple Lane, she just knew there were more every time. The toll on her life was immediate and brutal. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by restless hours spent tossing in bed, her mind racing with exhaustion and anger. Dark circles bloomed under her eyes, and her once steady hands trembled as she tried to sketch. Her work suffered, clients sent back revisions with notes about sloppy lines and uninspired designs, and deadlines loomed like storm clouds. She snapped at a coworker during a Zoom call, something she'd never done before, and her usually warm chats with the Hendersons over the fence turned curt. She caught herself staring at her reflection one morning, barely recognizing the haggard woman glaring back. The stress gnawed at her, a constant ache in her chest, and she wondered how long she could hold it together. Emily wasn't one to escalate things lightly, but she couldn't take it anymore. After a particularly unbearable Friday night, karaoke until 2 a.m., followed by a shouting match that woke her at 4, she decided to call in reinforcements. Willow Creek didn't have a formal homeowners association, but there was a neighborhood committee, a loose group of residents who handled minor disputes and upkeep. She emailed them first, detailing the noise, the frequency, the impact. No response came that weekend. On Monday, she called the committee chair, a stern retiree named Tom Grayson who lived 3 streets over. "Emily, I hear you," Tom said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "But we don't have much authority here. Noise complaints? That's more for the cops. Have you tried talking to them again?" "I did," she said, frustration creeping into her tone. "They said they'd keep it down, but it's worse now. I just need some sleep, Tom." He sighed. "Look, I'll send them a letter about community standards, but don't expect miracles. Call the police next time it's late. They've got the muscle we don't. The letter, if it was ever sent, changed nothing. That night, the music blared until 1 a.m. Emily took Tom's advice and dialed the non-emergency police line. A tired-sounding dispatcher took her complaint, promising to send a patrol car when one's available. An hour later, a cruiser rolled by, slowed in front of the house, and left without stopping. The party raged on. She called again the next week, and this time an officer knocked on Jake's door at 11 p.m. The music dipped for an hour, then roared back to life. The police, it seemed, were too overstretched, or too indifferent, to care about a noisy house in a quiet suburb. Emily's frustration boiled into despair. The system she trusted to protect her peace had failed her. She felt abandoned, trapped in a loop of sleepless nights and empty promises. If the committee and the cops wouldn't help, she'd have to find another way. She wasn't alone in her misery, though, at least, she hoped not. One Saturday morning, after a night that ended with Tyler screaming profanities at someone in the street, Emily decided to test the waters with her neighbors. She started with the Hendersons, catching them as they pruned their roses. "Morning," she said, forcing a smile. "Rough night, huh? Mr. Henderson snorted, clipping a thorn with more force than necessary. "Those kids are a damn menace. We barely slept." Mrs. Henderson nodded, her lips tight. "I don't know how you stand it, living right next door. I'd have lost my mind by now. Have you thought about doing anything?" Emily asked. "Like, complaining together?" Mr. Henderson hesitated. "We've grumbled about it, sure. But I don't like stirring the pot. They'll move out eventually, right?" Emily's heart sank. She tried Mrs. Delaney next, knocking on her door with a plate of store-bought cookies as an excuse. The old woman invited her in, her living room a museum of floral upholstery and faded photos. "It's awful, isn't it?" Mrs. Delaney said after Emily broached the subject. "I can't hear my shows anymore over that racket. But I'm too old to fight battles, dear. I just turn up my hearing aid and pray they tire themselves out." Across the street, the Garcias were politer but no more helpful. "It's loud, yeah, Mr. Garcia admitted, juggling a soccer ball with his son. "But we're used to noise, two teens, you know. We just closed the windows." Emily trudged home, deflated. The neighborhood wasn't united, some were annoyed, others apathetic, and no one wanted to stick their neck out. But as she sat at her kitchen table, nursing a third cup of coffee, an idea flickered. She couldn't force them to act, but maybe she didn't have to do this alone. She texted the Hendersons, asking if they'd meet her privately that evening. To her surprise, they agreed. Mrs. Delaney declined but sent a note saying she'd back them quietly. The Garcias stayed silent. That night, the three of them huddled in Emily's living room, the faint thump of music already starting next door. Mr. Henderson paced, his frustration spilling out. "I'm sick of this. My blood pressure's through the roof." "We need a plan," Emily said. "Talking doesn't work. The police barely care. We've got to make them listen." Mrs. Henderson frowned. "What, like a petition?" "Maybe," Emily said. "Or proof. Something they can't ignore." The idea took root. She'd read online about people documenting neighbor disputes, videos, logs, anything to build a case. If the authorities wouldn't act on complaints alone, she'd give them evidence they couldn't dismiss. The Hendersons were skeptical but willing. "We'll keep a log, Mr. Henderson said. Times, noise levels. You record what you can." Emily nodded. "I'll start tonight." It wasn't easy. She bought a cheap audio recorder online, setting it up near her bedroom window that first night. The party kicked off at 9 p.m., and she captured it all: thumping bass, shrieks of laughter, a slurred argument about a lost phone. She logged the times in a notebook: 9:03 p.m., music starts; 11:47 p.m., karaoke begins; 2:15 a.m., shouting in the yard. Her phone's camera became her second tool, snapping blurry shots of the crowd through her curtains. She felt like a spy, heart pounding every time a shadow moved too close to her window. The risks piled up fast. One night, she leaned out to adjust the recorder, and Mia spotted her, waving drunkenly. "Hey, neighbor. Taking pics for the scrapbook?" Emily ducked inside, cheeks burning, praying they wouldn't suspect her real intent. Another time, Tyler tossed a beer can over the fence, and it landed inches from her recorder. She retrieved it in the morning, hands shaking, and added it to her growing stash of evidence: cans, cups, even a singed bottle cap from the fire pit. The Hendersons reported their own findings: parties 4 nights that week, noise past midnight each time. Mrs. Delaney slipped Emily a note about a Tuesday night racket that drowned out her late-night talk show. Emily typed it all into a spreadsheet, her designer's eye making it neat and undeniable. She didn't know what she'd do with it yet: take it to the police, the committee, maybe a lawyer, but it gave her purpose. Each recording, each timestamp, was a brick in the wall she was building against the chaos next door. But the strain was wearing her down. She jumped at every sound, slept with one eye open, and saw suspicion in every glance from Jake or Mia. The evidence grew, but so did her exhaustion, and her fear that this fight might cost her more than she could afford to lose. Part 3, the climax of the conflict and retaliatory actions. The tipping point came on a humid Friday night in late March, a night that would sear itself into Emily Carter's memory as the worst yet. The air was thick with the promise of spring, but any hope of a quiet evening evaporated when the first bass notes rumbled through Willow Creek at 8 p.m. By 9, the party next door had exploded into a full-blown spectacle. Emily peeked through her curtains and saw a crowd that dwarfed anything she'd witnessed before: easily 40 people, maybe more, spilling across Jake, Mia, and Tyler's yard and onto the street. Cars lined both sides of Maple Lane, their engines growling as new arrivals squeezed into every available spot. The fire pit roared, flames licking high into the night, while the speaker system, now apparently upgraded to something industrial grade, blasted a relentless mix of hip-hop and techno that shook the ground beneath her feet. The chaos escalated hour by hour. At 11 p.m., the karaoke machine roared to life again, this time with a group of strangers massacring Bohemian Rhapsody so badly that Emily's windows seemed to groan in protest. By midnight, the shouting started, slurred arguments about who drunk the last beer, punctuated by the occasional crash of glass. She flinched as a bottle sailed over her fence and shattered against her patio, scattering shards across the concrete. At 2 a.m., a fight broke out in the yard, fists flying, voices bellowing obscenities, and the sickening thud of someone hitting the grass. The music never stopped, a deafening backdrop to the madness. Emily stood at her window, recorder rolling, watching in disbelief as a guy she didn't recognize stumbled into her flower bed and vomited into the petunias she'd planted last spring. The party didn't wind down, it crashed into dawn. At 5 a.m., when the last stragglers finally staggered away, the silence felt alien, oppressive. Emily hadn't slept a wink. Her head throbbed, her hands shook, and a raw, burning anger pulsed through her veins. She wasn't just tired, she was done. Done with the noise, the disrespect, the endless nights of stolen peace. She glanced at the recorder, its red light still blinking, and then at the spreadsheet on her laptop, now a sprawling catalog of misery. This wasn't just a nuisance anymore, it was a war. And she wasn't fighting alone. That morning, she texted the Hendersons. Meeting. My place. Noon. They arrived pale and furious, their own night ruined by the chaos. Mrs. Delaney sent a note via her grandson, who'd biked over, "I'm with you." That was hell. Even Mr. Garcia called, his voice tight. "My kids couldn't sleep. We're in." For the first time, Emily felt a flicker of hope, a small, fragile alliance forming in the wreckage of their shared exhaustion. "We can't keep living like this," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Last night was it. We're done asking nicely." Mr. Henderson nodded, his jaw tight. "What's the plan? Cops again?" "They won't do enough," Emily said. "We've got evidence, hours of it. But we need to hit back harder. Make them feel it." Mrs. Henderson raised an eyebrow. "You mean confront them? All of us?" "Yes," Emily said. "Tonight. Before they recover. And if that doesn't work," she paused, a spark of defiance igniting in her chest. "We get creative." The confrontation came at dusk. The trio's house was a disaster, cans and cups littered the yard, the fire pit still smoldered, and a faint stench of stale beer hung in the air. Emily led the charge, flanked by the Hendersons and Mr. Garcia. She pounded on the door, her knuckles stinging with each blow. Jake answered, bleary-eyed and shirtless, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "What's up, neighbor?" he said, smirking. "Rough night?" Emily didn't flinch. "You've gone too far. That wasn't a party, it was a riot. It ends now." Jake's smirk faded as the others stepped forward. Mr. Henderson's voice boomed. "You woke up half the street. My wife's got a heart condition, she can't take this." Mr. Garcia crossed his arms. "My kids have school. You're keeping them up all night. This stops, or we make it stop." Mia appeared behind Jake, rubbing her eyes. "Whoa, chill out. It's just a good time. You're overreacting." "Overreacting?" Emily snapped, pulling out her phone. She played a clip from last night, screaming, glass breaking, the relentless bass. "This is what we live with. Every damn night. You're done." Jake laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You're recording us? That's creepy, lady. Get a life." "We've got hours of it," Emily said, her voice cold. "And we're taking it to the police, the committee, whoever'll listen. You want fines? Eviction? Keep it up." Tyler lumbered into view, his bulk filling the doorway. "You're threatening us? Over some music? Screw off." The air crackled with tension. Mr. Henderson stepped closer, fists clenched. "You don't get to ruin our homes and act like victims. Turn it down, or we'll turn it up for you." Jake shoved a finger in Emily's face. "Try it. See what happens." Then he slammed the door. The group retreated, adrenaline pumping. Emily's heart raced, but she felt alive, finally fighting back. "They won't listen," she said. "So we push harder." The creative phase began the next morning. Emily woke at 6 a.m., fueled by spite and coffee. She dragged her old stereo to the porch, aimed it at their house, and blasted a children's album, Baby Shark, Barney, The Works, at full volume. The Hendersons joined in, setting up their ancient record player with Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries on loop. The cacophony hit like a sledgehammer, a deliberate middle finger to the hungover trio next. Door. Jake stumbled out at 7, yelling over the noise. "What the hell is this? Turn it off." Emily leaned over her railing, grinning. "Can't sleep? Too bad. We're just having fun." He flipped her off and stormed back inside, but the seed was planted. That night, when their music started at 10, Emily countered with a spotlight she'd borrowed from Mr. Garcia's garage. She aimed it at their windows, bathing their living room in harsh white light. The party faltered, guests shielded their eyes, and Mia shouted something incoherent from the porch. The music dipped, then stopped. For one glorious hour, silence reigned. The retaliation wasn't one-sided. The next day, Emily found her mailbox stuffed with crumpled Solo cups and a note, "Mind your own business, freak." That night, their music hit new decibels, as if daring her to respond. She did, more spotlight, more morning symphonies. The Hendersons reported a trash bag dumped in their roses, and Mr. Garcia caught Tyler tossing cigarette butts into his driveway. It was petty, spiteful, and escalating fast. Cracks showed in the trio, too. One night, Emily overheard Mia yelling at Jake through their open window. "I'm sick of this. They're nuts because of you." Tyler grumbled something about not signing up for a war. The parties didn't stop, but they grew shorter, less enthusiastic. Emily's tactics were working, slowly, messily, but working. The neighborhood began to shift. Mrs. Delaney started leaving baked goods on Emily's porch with notes, "Keep it up, dear." A shy couple from 2 streets over, the Patels, approached her one afternoon. "We hear it too, Mrs. Patel said. Can we sign something?" Emily handed them her petition, now up to 10 signatures. Word spread, and whispers of support turned into quiet nods at mailboxes and grocery runs. The tide was turning. The pressure finally forced the committee's hand. Tom Grayson called a meeting at the community center, a cramped room with folding chairs and stale coffee. Emily brought her evidence, recordings, logs, photos, the works. The Hendersons and Garcias backed her up, their voices raw with frustration. Jake and Mia showed up, arms crossed, defiant. "It's our house," Jake said. "We can do what we want." Tom rubbed his temples. "Not when it's disturbing the peace. We've got laws, kid. You're on thin ice." The meeting dissolved into shouting, Jake blaming Emily, Emily firing back with dates and decibels. No resolution came, but the next day, a police cruiser parked on Maple Lane for an hour. The trio got a warning, one more complaint, and fines would follow. That night, the music stayed low. Emily slept for the first time in weeks. It wasn't over, the tension simmered, the petty jabs continued, but the worst had crested. Emily's war had drawn a line, and Willow Creek was starting to feel like home again. For now, at least, she'd won a fragile victory. #### Part 4, Resolution and Aftermath. The fragile truce Emily Carter had clawed out of the chaos next door held for exactly 5 days. 5 nights of muted music, shorter gatherings, and a cautious quiet that felt more like a standoff than peace. She slept, fitfully, still waking at every creak, but it was something. The neighborhood exhaled, tension easing just enough for hope to creep in. Then, on the 6th night, everything changed. It started with a scream, not the usual drunken yelp, but a sharp, panicked cry that cut through the stillness at 2 a.m. Emily jolted awake, heart pounding, and stumbled to her window. The scene unfolding next door was chaos of a different kind. Red and blue lights flashed across Maple Lane as an ambulance screeched to a halt. Paramedics rushed into Jake, Mia, and Tyler's house, their voices clipped and urgent. A small crowd of partygoers lingered in the yard, faces pale, some sobbing. Emily's recorder was still running, but this wasn't the evidence she'd expected to capture. She pieced it together later from whispers and police chatter she overheard through her cracked window. One of their guests, a guy no one seemed to know well, had collapsed mid-party. Too much booze, too many pills, or both, the details were murky. He'd stopped breathing for a few minutes before someone called 911. The paramedics revived him, barely, and whisked him away on a stretcher. Jake stood on the porch, hands in his hair, muttering, "This wasn't supposed to happen." Mia was crying hysterically, and Tyler paced the yard, kicking cans like they'd personally betrayed him. The party died instantly, the music silenced, the crowd scattering into the night. The next morning, Willow Creek buzzed with a new energy, not triumph, but unease. Emily met the Hendersons over the fence, their usual grumbling replaced by quiet shock. "Heard the kid might not make it, Mr. Henderson said, pruning Shear's idol in his hand. "Cops were here half the night." Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "Maybe this'll knock some sense into them." Emily didn't respond. She felt no satisfaction. Only a hollow ache. Her war had been about peace, not tragedy. Still, the incident shifted something, maybe everything. A new figure entered the fray that afternoon, Linda Voss, a wiry woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air. She knocked on Emily's door unannounced, introducing herself as a mediator from the city's community dispute program. "Heard about your little feud," she said, clipboard in hand. "And last night. I'm here to sort this mess out before it gets worse." Emily hesitated, then invited her in. Linda had already spoken to Tom Grayson and the police, who'd handed her Emily's stack of evidence after the ambulance call logged yet another complaint. "You've got a case," Linda said, flipping through the spreadsheet. "Recordings, logs, witnesses, this could go legal. Fines, eviction, the works. But I'd rather not see it end that way." "You?" "No," Emily admitted. "I just want my life back." Linda nodded. "Then let's try talking first. All of you." The meeting was set for the next evening at the community center. Emily arrived with the Hendersons, Mr. Garcia, and a handful of others who'd signed her petition, the Patels, a young couple named the Walkers, even Mrs. Delaney, leaning on her cane. Jake, Mia, and Tyler slouched in, looking wrecked, eyes red, shoulders slumped. The air was thick with exhaustion and unspoken guilt. Linda took charge, her voice firm but neutral. "We're not here to point fingers. We're here to fix this. Emily, you start." Emily laid it out, months of sleepless nights, ruined work, frayed nerves. She played a clip from the worst night, the one before the ambulance, letting the chaos speak for itself. The Hendersons added their piece, Mr. Garcia his, each voice layering the toll. Linda listened, jotting notes, then turned to the trio. "Your turn." Jake spoke first, voice low. "We didn't mean for that last night. It's messed us up, okay? We're not monsters." Mia wiped her eyes. "We just wanted to have fun. Didn't think it'd hurt anyone." Tyler stayed silent, staring at the floor. Linda leaned forward. "Fun's fine. Disturbing a whole street isn't. You've got a choice, work with us, or this goes higher. Cops, courts, landlords. You pick." The room held its breath. Jake rubbed his face, then nodded. "What do you want?" The agreement took shape over 2 hours of tense negotiation. No parties past 10 p.m. Music below a set decibel, Linda brought a meter to enforce it. No more than 10 guests at a time. Violations meant immediate police calls, backed by Emily's evidence and the committee's support. In return, Emily and the others dropped the legal threats. It wasn't perfect, but it was a lifeline. The trio stuck to it, mostly. The first week was quiet, the second tentative. Emily slept better, her recorder gathering dust. The Hendersons stopped glaring over the fence, and Mr. Garcia's kids waved again. But the scars lingered. Jake avoided eye contact and they crossed paths. Mia's laugh was rarer, and Tyler seemed to vanish into the house. The near-death had shaken them, maybe more than the neighbors' pushback. Then, 3 weeks later, a "for sale" sign sprouted in their yard. Emily saw it from her porch, a jolt of surprise mixing with relief. Mrs. Delaney hobbled over with the gossip, landlords kicking them out. Too many complaints, and that ambulance was the last straw. By mid-April, they were gone. A moving truck hauled away their mismatched furniture, and the house sat empty again. Emily watched it roll out, a weight lifting she hadn't realized she'd carried. The war was over, not with a bang, but a quiet exit. The aftermath reshaped Willow Creek in subtle ways. Emily's alliance with the Hendersons deepened, they invited her for coffee, swapped stories of the ordeal like veterans. Mr. Garcia brought his kids over to thank her, their shy smiles a balm. Mrs. Delaney baked more often, her notes now chatty instead of urgent. Even the Patels and Walkers, once on the fringes, joined a makeshift block party in May, grills out, kids running, a quiet celebration of reclaimed peace. But not everyone thawed. The Garcias' teens still shrugged off the saga, and a few holdouts, like a gruff widower down the street, muttered about busybody neighbors. The community wasn't flawless, it never had been. Yet something had shifted. Tom Grayson pushed for a noise ordinance at the next committee meeting, citing Emily's logs as proof of need. It passed narrowly, a small shield for the future. Emily changed too. She'd started this as a loner, guarding her quiet life, but the fight had pulled her into the neighborhood's orbit. She saw strength in herself she hadn't known, resolve, ingenuity, a stubborn streak that surprised even her. She also saw the cost, months of stress, a strained patience, a lingering weariness when night fell. She bought noise-canceling headphones, just in case, and moved her bed to the back of the house, a practical surrender she hated. Admitting. The lessons lingered. Respect wasn't guaranteed, it had to be claimed. Quiet was a right, not a gift, and communities could bend under pressure, sometimes breaking, sometimes bonding. Emily learned to speak up, to lean on others, to fight without losing herself. She wasn't naive anymore, peace could vanish, and she'd be ready if it did. One evening, as summer crept in, she sat on her porch with a sketchpad, the street hushed but alive, kids biking, a dog barking faintly. The empty house next door loomed, a silent reminder. She wondered who'd move in next, what they'd bring. For now, though, Willow Creek was hers again, not perfect, not permanent, but hers. She drew the oak trees, the fading light, and let the quiet settle in her bones. #### Part 5, Conclusion and Reflection. Emily Carter's journey through the tumult of Willow Creek had been a long, jagged arc, from the quiet solitude of her blue ranch house to a battlefield of noise and defiance, and finally to a hard-won peace that felt both fragile and precious. It began with the arrival of Jake, Mia, and Tyler, a trio whose relentless parties shattered the stillness she cherished. What followed was a saga of sleepless nights, mounting frustration, and a neighborhood pushed to its limits. She'd gathered evidence, hours of recordings, meticulous logs, formed an uneasy alliance with the Hendersons, Mr. Garcia, and others, and waged a war of wills that escalated from polite pleas to creative retaliation. The turning point came with the ambulance, a near tragedy that silenced the chaos and forced a reckoning. Mediation followed, then the trio's quiet departure, leaving behind an empty house and a community forever changed. Looking back, Emily saw it as more than a fight over noise. It was a collision of freedoms, theirs to revel, hers to rest, and a test of where one person's rights ended and another's began. She'd started as an outsider in her own neighborhood, content in her isolation, but the ordeal dragged her into the messy, vital heart of communal life. She'd learned to speak, to push, to bend without breaking. The Hendersons' gruff support, Mrs. Delaney's quiet notes, the Garcias' reluctant solidarity, they'd woven a thread of connection she hadn't sought but now couldn't imagine losing. Her victory wasn't just the silence that returned, it was the strength she'd found in herself and the fragile unity she'd helped forge. The deeper lesson, though, lay in balance. Jake, Mia, and Tyler weren't villains, they were young, reckless, blind to the ripples they sent crashing through Maple Lane. Their freedom to live loudly clashed with the community's need for peace, and neither side had listened well at first. Emily saw her own fault in that, her initial silence, her assumption they'd self-correct. Respect, she realized, wasn't a given, it was a dialogue, a boundary drawn through patience and, sometimes, confrontation. The trio's excess had been a kind of power, unintentional but real, and it took persistence, hers, the neighborhood's, to reclaim what was fair. Like the judge in that old Davis story she'd read online, or the narrator in HOA Karen, standing up to overreach wasn't easy, but it mattered. It was about dignity, about saying, this is my space too. What of the future? Emily gazed at the empty house next door, its "for sale" sign a mute promise of change. New neighbors would come, maybe quiet, maybe not. The noise ordinance Tom Grayson had pushed through offered some armor, but she knew peace was never permanent. Willow Creek had healed, but its scars whispered a warning, trouble could return, here or anywhere. People moved, lives shifted, and communities were only as strong as the will to hold them together. She'd be ready, headphones on standby, recorder in the drawer, a network of allies closer than before. The quiet she savored now was a gift, not a guarantee. That evening, as the sun dipped below the oaks, Emily sat on her porch with a cup of tea, the street alive with the soft hum of normalcy, kids laughing, a lawnmower buzzing faintly. She thought about what it all meant. Living together wasn't just coexistence, it was a pact, spoken or not, to honor each other's space, to listen when the balance tipped. Her fight had been small in the grand scheme, a suburban spat, not a courtroom drama, but it echoed something universal. Communities thrived on give and take, on the courage to confront what's wrong and the grace to mend it. She'd stood up, not just for herself, but for a principle: no one should drown out another's right to belong. The stars emerged, and Emily breathed in the stillness. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was home, a place worth defending. She hoped its next chapter would be kinder, that its residents would remember this lesson: harmony wasn't accidental. It was built, step by stubborn step, through voices raised and hands extended. And in that fragile, flawed dance, there was something worth fighting for: a quiet night, a shared street, a life woven into the lives around it. And there you have it, the dust has settled on Willow Creek, but the echoes of this epic clash linger like a front-page exclusive you can't unsee. From sleepless nights to a near tragedy that flipped the script, Emily Carter's stand wasn't just about silence, it was a thunderclap for respect, community, and the gritty power of standing up when the odds stack high. You've made it through every pulse-pounding twist. Did it shock you? Move you? Make you cheer? We poured every ounce of this saga into this video, and now it's your turn to weigh in. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Emily's shoes? Did this hit close to home? Smash that like button if this tale struck a chord, and if you haven't yet, subscribe, because Heartfelt Tales isn't done yet. We've got more stories brewing that'll shake you to your core. Share this with anyone who needs a dose of real-life drama, and stick around, because the next chapter's coming, and it's going to be a wild ride. Until then, keep listening, keep feeling, and we'll see you in the next tale.